Something just happened over Israel, and almost no one is explaining it correctly. Because if you compare what official briefings are saying to what actually unfolded in the sky, you'll notice a gap so wide, it changes how we understand modern warfare. For nearly 3 straight hours, the night sky wasn't quiet. It was a battlefield. Explosions, interceptions, incoming projectiles, not a warning shot, not a limited strike, a sustained, synchronized assault. And if you understand what really happened, you'll realize this wasn't just another escalation. This may have exposed a fundamental weakness in one of the most advanced defense systems on Earth. The contradiction. Official briefings have been remarkably consistent in their messaging. Iran's offensive capabilities have been severely degraded. Some assessments have gone even further, suggesting that as much as 80 to 90% of its effective strike capacity has already been neutralized. On the surface, that sounds definitive. It creates the impression of control, of a threat that has been largely contained, reduced, and pushed into a position where it can no longer operate at scale. But that narrative begins to fall apart the moment you compare it with what actually unfolded. Because a force that has truly lost the majority of its offensive capability does not sustain a coordinated, multi-hour assault over one of the most heavily defended airspaces on the planet. It doesn't maintain operational tempo for hours at a time. It doesn't demonstrate synchronization, layering, and persistence under pressure. And yet, that's exactly what happened. For nearly 3 continuous hours, the sky over central Israel reflected something very different from the picture being presented in official statements. Interceptions were visible. Incoming projectiles continued. The engagement didn't taper off quickly. It didn't resemble a limited response or a symbolic show of force. It looked organized. It looked deliberate. And most importantly, it looked sustained. That creates a contradiction that can't be ignored. Because either the assessments are incomplete, or the situation has evolved faster than the narrative surrounding it. And in modern conflicts, that gap between what is said publicly and what is happening operationally is where the most important realities tend to exist. When official messaging and observable outcomes no longer align, it usually signals that something critical is being overlooked. It could be a shift in strategy, a change in technology, or an adaptation that hasn't yet been fully understood or acknowledged. Whatever the cause, one thing becomes clear: we are not looking at the full picture. And until that gap is closed, any conclusion drawn from the official narrative alone is likely to be incomplete and potentially misleading. What actually changed? Most coverage so far has focused on a single, easy-to-measure metric: how many missiles were launched. It's the number that shows up in headlines, briefings, and breaking news alerts. It's clean, it's simple, and it gives the impression that we're tracking the scale of the threat in real time. But that focus misses the point, because in modern warfare, raw numbers don't always tell you what actually matters. A smaller number of more advanced systems can produce effects that far exceed a larger volume of conventional ones, and that's exactly where the real shift is happening. The change we're seeing isn't primarily about how many missiles are being fired. It's about what those missiles are designed to do. There is a clear transition underway from traditional ballistic strikes, which follow predictable trajectories and deliver a single payload, to far more complex systems engineered to challenge the very assumptions that missile defense relies on. These newer designs introduce multiple layers of difficulty for defenders. They don't just travel from point A to point B. They can alter behavior mid-flight, deploy payloads in unconventional ways, and create multiple simultaneous threats from a single launch. Instead of presenting a single, trackable object, they create a dynamic problem, one that evolves in real time. That distinction is critical, because missile defense systems are built on prediction. They calculate where an incoming object will be, when it will arrive, and how to intercept it efficiently. When the incoming threat behaves in a predictable way, that system works extremely well. But when the design of the weapon itself is built to disrupt that predictability, the entire equation starts to break down. Now, instead of solving a single trajectory, the system is forced to react to multiple variables at once. Timing becomes tighter, margins for error shrink, and the probability of a clean interception decreases. This is why focusing only on missile counts can be misleading. You could see fewer launches on paper and still be facing a more dangerous, more effective threat in reality. Because what's changing here is not just the scale of the attack. It's the nature of the attack itself. And once the nature of the threat evolves beyond what existing defenses were optimized for, even the most advanced systems in the world can begin to show strain. The weapon that changes the game. Let's simplify this as much as possible. A conventional ballistic missile follows a very clear logic. It carries a single warhead, one missile, one target, one impact point. Everything about modern missile defense systems is built around that assumption. The system detects the launch, tracks the trajectory, calculates where the object will land, and then deploys an interceptor to destroy it before it reaches its target. It's a structured process. Predict, track, intercept, eliminate. At its core, it operates on binary logic. Either the missile is successfully intercepted, or it isn't. That model has worked remarkably well for decades because the threat itself behaved in predictable ways. Even when missiles became faster or more precise, they still followed a basic rule. One incoming object equals one problem to solve. But that rule is now being challenged because the weapons being used in these newer attacks are not designed to behave like traditional ballistic systems. They are using cluster warheads, and that changes everything. Instead of carrying a single explosive payload all the way to the ground, a cluster warhead is designed to open mid-air at a pre-programmed altitude. When it does, the outer shell separates and releases multiple smaller submunitions, sometimes dozens, from a single missile. Each of those submunitions becomes its own independent falling object, its own trajectory, its own impact point. So now, what started as one missile has effectively turned into many. And they don't land in one place. They spread out across a wide area, creating multiple simultaneous impact zones instead of a single strike location. This fundamentally disrupts how missile defense systems are designed to operate, because instead of tracking and intercepting one clearly defined target, the system is suddenly dealing with a fragmented, distributed threat. The clean binary equation, hit or miss, no longer applies in the same way. Even if the main missile is intercepted, the outcome isn't always straightforward. If the warhead has already begun to disperse, or if the interception isn't perfectly timed, those submunitions can still continue toward the ground, which means the threat isn't fully neutralized. It's multiplied, and that's what makes this shift so significant. It's not just a new weapon, it's a weapon designed specifically to complicate, and in some cases overwhelm, the logic that modern missile defense depends on. Why cluster warheads are different. To understand why this matters, you have to look at how these weapons actually behave in real conditions. A traditional missile is straightforward in its effect. It travels along a defined path, reaches its target area, and produces a single explosion. The damage is concentrated, and the threat is contained to one specific point. Cluster warheads operate on a completely different principle. Instead of staying intact all the way to impact, a cluster warhead is designed to open while it's still in the air, often at a carefully calculated altitude. At that moment, the outer casing separates, and what was once a single payload breaks apart into dozens of smaller submunitions. These submunitions don't stay together. They spread out. Each one follows its own descent path toward the ground, and each one carries its own explosive charge. So instead of one missile creating one impact point, you now have a single launch generating multiple simultaneous impact zones. That's a fundamental shift. Because now, one missile no longer equals one target. It can equal dozens, and those impacts don't occur in a tight cluster. They can cover a wide geographic area, depending on the design and release altitude. That means infrastructure, vehicles, and open spaces across a broader zone are all at risk at the same time. For a defense system, this creates a much more complex problem. Intercepting a traditional missile is about stopping a single object before it reaches the ground. But with cluster warheads, the timing of that interception becomes critical. If the interception happens before the warhead opens, the threat can be neutralized in a relatively clean way. But if that timing is even slightly off, the situation changes. If the warhead has already begun to disperse, or if the interception causes it to break apart, those submunitions can continue falling independently. In that case, the original missile is no longer a single threat that can be eliminated with one successful intercept. It becomes a distributed event, and in some scenarios, an imperfect interception can actually increase unpredictability, scattering submunitions across a wider area than originally intended. That's what makes cluster warheads so challenging. They don't just increase destructive potential, they complicate the entire defensive equation. Because instead of solving one problem, you're suddenly dealing with many at the same time across multiple locations with far less control over the outcome. The defense system problem. Israel's air and missile defense architecture is widely considered one of the most advanced ever built. It isn't a single system. It's a layered network designed to handle different types of threats at different ranges and altitudes. At the top layer, you have systems built to intercept long-range ballistic missiles, often outside the atmosphere. These are designed to detect threats early and neutralize them before they descend toward populated areas. Below that, there are systems focused on medium-range threats, missiles that travel shorter distances but still pose significant risk to infrastructure and military targets. And at the lowest layer, there are systems specifically designed to intercept short-range rockets and projectiles, often in real time, over cities and populated regions. Each layer is highly sophisticated. Each is optimized for a specific type of threat, and together they create a defensive shield that has, in many cases, been remarkably effective. But despite all that complexity, they share a common foundation, a core assumption that incoming threats behave in predictable ways. Missiles follow a trajectory. That trajectory can be tracked. Once it's tracked, it can be calculated. And once it's calculated, an interceptor can be launched to meet it at the right point in space and time. That's the logic everything is built on. Prediction, timing, precision. But cluster warheads disrupt that foundation because they don't behave like a single object moving along a clean, predictable path. They introduce fragmentation, dispersion, and multiple independent trajectories, all from a single launch. Suddenly, the system is no longer dealing with one trackable object. It's dealing with many, and those objects may not follow the same predictable patterns the system was designed to counter. This is where the problem begins. Because once that core assumption, predictability, breaks down, the reliability of the entire system starts to degrade. Interceptors are no longer solving a single equation. They're responding to a rapidly changing scenario with multiple variables. Timing becomes more difficult, tracking becomes more complex, and the margin for error becomes much smaller. In other words, the math changes. And in warfare, that matters more than almost anything else. Because these systems are built on calculations, on probabilities, on timing windows, on expected behavior. When those calculations no longer hold, even the most advanced defense can begin to show gaps, not because it's poorly designed, but because it's being challenged in ways it wasn't originally optimized for. And when the math changes at that level, everything built on top of it changes too. When success becomes failure, here's where it gets even more complicated. Let's say a missile is intercepted. Under normal circumstances, that's a success. Threat eliminated. But with cluster warheads, an imperfect interception can trigger early dispersal. Instead of stopping the attack, you've just turned one threat into dozens, spread across an unpredictable area. So now the system isn't just trying to stop missiles, it's trying to manage chaos. And chaos is much harder to control. Adaptation, not weakness. This shift tells us something important. This isn't a desperate move. It's a strategic adaptation. If your launch capacity is reduced, you don't just fire fewer missiles. You redesign them to maximize impact. Fewer launches, greater effect. That's exactly what we're seeing, and it's working. The next layer, maneuverability. But it doesn't stop there. Some of these systems aren't following fixed trajectories anymore. They're maneuvering, adjusting their path during descent, which creates a serious problem for interception systems. Because those systems rely on prediction. They calculate where a missile will be before it gets there. But if the missile changes course, that calculation becomes unreliable, and timing becomes everything. A fraction of a second off, and the intercept fails. The strategy no one is talking about. Now here's the part that almost no one is discussing. And it may be the most important development of all. These attacks aren't just targeting cities or infrastructure. They're targeting the systems that make defense possible. Radar installations, early warning systems, tracking networks. Because missile defense doesn't start with interception. It starts with detection. And if you can blind the system, you don't have to defeat it directly. You just make it ineffective. This is what analysts are calling a blinding strategy. And if it's working, it changes the balance between offense and defense entirely. Why this matters globally. Now you might be thinking, this is a regional conflict. It's not. Because the consequences don't stay on the battlefield. They spread fast. Energy markets, shipping routes, supply chains, all of them are already reacting. And one location sits at the center of it all, the Strait of Hormuz. A narrow corridor through which a significant portion of the world's oil flows. If that corridor is disrupted, the effects ripple across the global economy. Fuel prices rise, transportation costs increase, food prices follow, industries slow down, and suddenly, a conflict thousands of miles away starts affecting everyday life. The economic shockwave, we're already seeing early signs. shipping disruptions, energy price volatility, market uncertainty. These aren't isolated events. They're connected. Because modern warfare isn't just about territory, it's about systems, economic systems, logistical systems, global systems, and when those systems are stressed, the impact is widespread. Two possible paths. At this point, there are only two realistic scenarios. Path 1. De-escalation. Diplomatic pressure builds. Both sides step back. The situation stabilizes. Damage is contained. Path 2. Escalation. Each strike leads to a larger response. More advanced weapons are deployed. Defense systems become increasingly strained. Economic pressure intensifies, and the situation expands beyond its current boundaries. Right now, the signals are mixed. But the trajectory? It's leaning toward escalation. The big question. So the real question isn't who is winning. The real question is, are we witnessing a shift in how wars are fought? Because if offensive systems are evolving faster than defensive ones, then the balance that has defined modern military strategy may no longer hold. And if that balance breaks, the implications go far beyond this conflict. This story is still developing, and the next phase could change everything. If you want analysis that goes beyond headlines and focuses on what's actually happening, subscribe now. Because the gap between perception and reality is only getting wider, and the cost of misunderstanding it is getting higher.